This week, our attention is going to be focused on René Descartes, and you immediately, I hope, realize what's happening in relationship to this intersection of traditions in modern times. We've looked at Bacon and Hobbes from the British empiricist tradition that's developing, taking us up to about 1700. And we're now looking at Descartes, who will be followed by Spinoza and Leibniz, which will take us up to about 1700 in the continental rationalist tradition. So we're swinging over to continental philosophy. And the contrast all the way down the line works out something like this. Hobbes, as we have seen, is very plainly a nominalist, very much influenced by William of Ockham. No real universals. The only explanatory principles needed in explaining any process at all in the physical world or in human beings or in the body politic, simply efficient cause, material cause, no formal or final causes. And consequently, his nominalism gives rise to a purely empiricist kind of epistemology in which he tries to see in good Baconian fashion what are the uniform patterns of apparent cause-effect relationship. And in contrast to that, we'll find that Descartes is not a nominalist, but a conceptualist. And of course, it's that which makes possible his rationalism, namely the kind of rationalism which maintains we have some intuitive, in a sense other than Plato's, innate knowledge of general principles, universal concepts, you see, so that he's able to get his logically universal premises as something other than empirical generalizations, because he's a conceptualist. We do have intuitive knowledge of certain universal principles. So Descartes, then, the rationalist, in that theory of knowledge, both Hobbes and Descartes have a representational view. That is to say, the consciousness is, and I say consciousness rather than mind in talking about Hobbes for obvious reasons, okay? The consciousness is immediately aware of its ideas which represent to it external realities. So the point is that there is a cognitive partition between our mental states and external realities, such that we don't have any direct awareness of external realities. We only know them by virtue of these representations in the consciousness, namely our ideas. Sense ideas, empirical ideas for Hobbes, but it would include, of course, intuitive ideas for Descartes. But in both cases, they have a representational theory of knowledge. Okay, that'll become very, very important. We saw it in Hobbes in terms of his distinction between primary and secondary qualities, because while the primary qualities are indeed qualities of external things, they're represented in our minds in association with secondary qualities, you see. And those secondary qualities are purely subjective representations with no objective counterpart. So the epistemology then comes out that way. And talking of methodology, I mentioned that Hobbes' method is one that he drew from Galileo, a reconstitutive method, an attempt to restructure our understanding in form of a deductive system with empirical premises. So that's simply, if you like, a pedagogical or rhetorical way of structuring it for easy understanding and seeing of implications. There is a marked comparison between that and Descartes, because both Hobbes and Descartes want their philosophy to take the form of a deductive system. However, the pattern which Descartes is following is not that of empirical premises leading to a deductive system, but rather self-evident truths or intuitive premises, as in mathematics. So that the model for Descartes is that of a geometrical system, where you have axioms followed by deductive proofs leading to hard and certain conclusions. Okay? And part of the reason Descartes does that is in his reaction against the skepticism that was looming up of the day. What he wanted was complete certainty, either intuitive certainty or logical certainty. And so intuitively certain premises and logically certain conclusions by virtue of the mathematical method. And we'll open that up later on as we get into it. In the development of their philosophical beliefs, Hobbes comes out as a clear-cut materialist. Matter and motion seems to explain everything. Descartes, on the other hand, is a dualist. He wants to distinguish mind from matter and maintains that minds or souls are immaterial entities, so that a human being is a composite of two different kinds of things. A physically extended entity, matter, and a thinking entity, mind, or soul, dualism. Okay? Hobbes was a determinist. Yes, everything, including our thoughts and decisions, are causally determined. What we think is a free decision is simply our ambivalence between two conflicting drives, motives, you see, and the choice is simply coming down on one side of that oscillation. On the other hand, Descartes, with a mind, soul that has a separate status from that of body, is able to say that mind is independent of those causal mechanisms. And so Descartes asserts the freedom of the will, freedom of our choices. He's a libertarian rather than a determinist. Psychological egoism characterizes Hobbes, that is to say, our drive for survival, self-preservation is the consuming passion, and that self-interest then is what drives us in everything we do. The result is that when it comes to ethics, his appeal to right reason, which was the very thing that Occam had appealed to, the appeal to right reason is in terms of prudence and consequences, and what he speaks of as natural law is certainly not natural law grounded metaphysically in the nature of reality. It's simply the natural kind of law which humans are going to go for out of the desire for self-preservation. Namely, make peace if you want to survive. Make peace. The first rule of prudence. And that's what he calls natural law. The general ethical approach of Hobbes is a strong kind of hedonism that runs through it, is really an Epicurean kind of ethic, if you can hark back to the Hellenistic period, whereas we'll see that Descartes is closer to a Stoic ethic. He doesn't write systematically in ethics, but he does have a book on the passions, emotions, feelings. And his view is that our passions, our emotions, desires, are themselves good, but they can get us into a mess. In other words, he has a more positive view of human nature than Hobbes does. What the passions need is simply a little rational guidance. So it's a matter of the rule of reason over the passions, and the good naturally follows. So it's much more of a Stoic ethic. The thing that Hobbes has been working towards is this Erastian view of the relationship between church and state. That is to say that in matters where there are religious differences and controversies, where sectarianism and conflict breaks out, as in the English Civil War, what we must do is to submit to the decision of the state in that regard, and accordingly the state has authority over what is going to be a church doctrine. Now, the basics of the Christian faith are one thing. There is agreement. Existence of God, the divine Trinity, the forgiveness through Christ. But beyond basics of that sort, in order to avoid the religious conflicts that were so pervasive on the continent as well as in Britain, the church subservient to the state. That Erastian view was quite common in Britain in that day. And on the other hand, Descartes seems to have been a fairly traditional Roman Catholic in his thinking about the church. And what that leaves us with, number 9, is what Hobbes thinks is philosophically significant about God, what seems to arise, though he never formulates the proof. He thinks that it's certainly persuasive, at least, that God must be the first efficient cause in the whole chain of cause and effect which has produced things as we know them today. That's about all he's willing to say, philosophically, because of his methodology, cause-effect mechanisms being unfolded. That's all he's willing to say about God. Though as a practicing broad church Anglican, he obviously seemed to believe more than that, but that on the authority of the church and the state. And he talks at length about biblical revelation. On the other hand, Descartes wants to say more. Descartes, remember, is a conceptualist, not a realist about universals. So in terms of what are the objective realities involved, he can only speak of God as efficient cause, not as formal cause, only as efficient cause. But he does want to have the picture of God which he gained from the medievals. He was educated in a Jesuit school at La Flèche, therefore was well acquainted with